So Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is involved in there's three important things you need to remember about Jackson. One, the Indian Removal Act, which we're going to refer to as Native American displacement. Two, the Bank War. The Bank War is about the national bank and whether or not it should exist. Remember, this is going back to the Federalist Party, and then after the War of 1812, it comes back. So we're debating about the bank again. And number three, the nullification crisis. And that's going to get us into this 2CO thing with North, South, and Western regions. So let's talk about Jackson. Here's Andrew Jackson. He became a hero at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Even though the war was technically over and the battle was fought a day or two after the treaty was signed, news didn't travel very well. Jackson defended the American port of New Orleans, defeated the British, and only lost a couple of soldiers. So he became a war hero. This launches his political career. He was a general. He was also a lawyer, self-taught, from Tennessee, and he is eventually going to become the governor of Tennessee, and he wants to become president. In 1819, he is serving in the military, and he is on a mission to go into Georgia to find some troublemakers, British folks that they think are riling up the indigenous populations and the freedom-seeking enslaved peoples. So Jackson, seeing it as his mission, decides that when he thinks the people have escaped into Florida, which was then a Spanish territory, that he should go into Florida, which is Spanish, in order to chase British folks that are riling up American enslaved people. He goes into Florida, which is technically invading another country. And he is searching for Seminoles. He's searching for these British folks. He eventually goes all the way to the tentative capital of Florida, occupies Florida. This makes President then James Madison furious, but Madison's Secretary of State sees this as an opportunity. And while Madison and the administration think that this is nigh on treasonous, since he's started a war, basically, or could have started a war, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State who's responsible for dealing with foreign countries, decides that he's going to talk with Spain, the Spanish ambassadors, and basically say, if you couldn't even defend Florida from us, how do you expect to take it? How do you expect to keep it? You should just give it to the United States. Spain ends up signing a treaty. Because of this unauthorized invasion, Jackson basically leads to the United States acquiring Florida through a treaty. Jackson is seen as young and reckless and does not follow the rules, and he becomes very popular with the people because of it. Excuse me. So, the brash young Jackson runs for president in 1824, and he wins the popular vote. However, there are several people running for the presidency, and it's not like modern presidential elections. The Electoral College was still mainly decided by the people in the Electoral College, not the votes of the general population. So the election was close. He does not get the required number of electoral votes to become president, and it is thrown into the House of Representatives, which is what happens if there's no clear majority in the Electoral College. So Jackson assumes that he's going to be made president because he has the most votes. This is not what happens. I believe it's Henry Clay decides that he's going to step out of the election, which allows his supporters to then go and join John Quincy Adams. This is seen as a corrupt bargain, a conspiracy against Jackson and the common man. You see, by this time, the election law has changed so that most white men were able to vote because they had eliminated the property requirements for a lot of the elections. So because of this conspiracy, this viewed conspiracy against Jackson, this riles up his base, right? His base of voters, the common man, so that in 1828, they elect people that will go and make sure that he wins the Electoral College in 1828. It's a huge election, one of the biggest elections percentage-wise in American history. And you can see here where most of his voters come from. They're coming from the South and the West. But in the North, they're still largely John Quincy Adams voters. But you can see here as well, he's a man of the people, self-made, first president born after the or not born after the revolution, but didn't come of age in the revolution. This is what we'd refer to as universal white male suffrage, right? The common man now has the right to vote. It's not just the landed aristocracy, the rich people there. We say universal white male suffrage because at the same time that white men are getting the right to vote, African Americans and others are being specifically disenfranchised. And we say male suffrage because it's only men that are allowed to vote. Suffrage, by the way, just means the right to vote. So don't get too caught up in that. This is all the stuff we just talked about. We refer to it as democratization, as white male suffrage, property requirements being taken away, almost all white men could vote, and black men are being disenfranchised, even in the North. Now, Jackson as president is not, he's very popular with the common man, but the elites were nervous about him. Jackson was in the business of making himself more powerful, which means making the executive branch more powerful. A generation before, the United States had just fought to get rid of a king. So there's a fear that Jackson, as you can see in this picture here, is trying to make himself like a king. And if you'll see right here, wrong side, right here, this is the Constitution. So his critics thought that he was trampling on the Constitution. And the weapon that he's using right there is the veto. Now, he had vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. And why does this matter? Because according to the ideology of the founding generation, these political elites, Congress was closest to the will of the people. The House of Representatives was directly elected by the people. The states picked the senators, so they are closer to the people. The executive branch is selected by political elite electors. So Congress believes that he's stepping on the will of the people. Jackson thinks that he is the will of the people, and there's a tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So 3 things, right? Let's start with Jackson's Native American displacement. And we can find this in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Andrew Jackson saw that white settlers wanted to move into the West, and this advancing white culture wanted to take the land of the Native Americans. Some Native American groups had actually assimilated to white culture. For example, the Cherokee living in Georgia. They had adapted white cultures. They had become farmers. They wore white dress. They were even enslavers themselves. History's complicated. The state of Georgia passed a couple of laws that were going to remove the Cherokee from their land. In some legal shenanigans here, there are 2 court cases that go all the way to the Supreme Court, both of which arguing that the Native Americans, the Cherokee, should be able to keep their land. The one that you need to remember is Worcester versus Georgia, right here, right here. In Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court decided that the Cherokee had an absolute right to keep their land in Western Georgia. And they decided that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, which means they are able to create their own laws and have their own governments, much like a state. In response to Worcester versus Georgia, Jackson probably apocryphally decided that they have made their decision, let's see them enforce it. In other words, Jackson defied the Supreme Court and didn't enforce this decision. In fact, supports Georgia when Georgia starts removing the Cherokee from their territory. We call this the Trail of Tears. Now, the Indian Removal Act is passed under the Jackson administration, and the act is to try to get the Native Americans to move across the Mississippi River. You see the Mississippi River right here. These are all different Native American tribes or groups that were expected to move west. This is the Cherokee here in West Georgia, and they're going to be moved over here onto what's called Indian land, or modern-day Oklahoma. These are other Native American tribes. One interesting to me is the Seminole down in Florida. They are also expected to move, but they use violent resistance, and they actually start a war with the United States that doesn't end until the early 1900s. So they didn't just passively accept this. The Trail of Tears is a forced relocation. Over 16,000 people were expected, are going to, over 16,000 people were forced to move, and thousands of people die on the trail into the West. It's one of the more embarrassing moments in American history. Let's talk quickly about the Bank War. Now, the Bank War it shows Jackson and his fear of Northern elites. Jackson is a Westerner. He was actually an Indian hunter while he was governor of Tennessee. He would lead missions to go and eliminate Native American tribes. So the Indian displacement went right along with his Western character. This ties into his Southern Western heritage, right? Because Southerners that moved west tended to act like Southerners. He is afraid of the wealthy bank interest, thought it was a tool to help Northern business interests, thought that it only allowed the accumulation of wealth by the wealthy, and he saw it as a constitutional violation of states' rights that favored the wealthy. Remember, he's a common man, right, in his mind, and he's supporting the common man, and he wants to limit the power of the banks. There's some political shenanigans that goes on here, but essentially, Jackson vetoes the bank's charter, right? The bank had to be rechartered. He vetoed the recharter and essentially just lets the bank die. But there's a lot of money in that bank. So what does he do with that money? He sends it to what are called pet banks, right? These pet banks are his favorite banks, which just happen to be Southern state banks. So it's a way to help the people that supported him, right? Those common man, those Southerners, gives that money to the state banks because money just doesn't disappear. And a lot of people saw that as a fairly corrupt move. Now, his supporters saw him, you see here, he's fighting the demon that controls the bank, right? So he's seen as almost a hero. But the political elites and the wealthy saw it as a corrupt move. Look at this guy. Where is he? Over here. Look at this guy, right? Great Halloween costume. This is John C. Calhoun. Now, in 1828, the Congress passed a tariff. Tariffs, again, are designed to protect industry. Various industries get them. They can target particular products. This tariff of 1828 was seen as a tariff of abominations. Abomination, something that's horrible, nasty, disgusting. Southerners thought that the tariff was there to protect Northern businessmen, kind of was, but it was designed to hurt the Southerners, or at least that's what they thought. So this leads to sectional conflict between those Northern business interests and the Southern business interests. And according to Calhoun here, Calhoun thought that the Southerners could just nullify this act of Congress. He writes about it in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Right? He's protesting this. And I believe he actually had to write it under a fake name because he's still the vice president of the country at the time. He supported this idea of nullification, which maybe you could call it states' rights, that a state could just decide not to follow the law. And this goes all the way back to, where is it? There it is. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, right? So remember, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were trying to say that a state could nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, he takes this next step further and says the state could nullify the tariff and just decide not to pay it. Calhoun, for some other reasons, along with this, decides that he can no longer fight against this growth of government power, federal government power, while being vice president. So he resigns, goes back to South Carolina. While he's in South Carolina fighting against Jackson, he gets South Carolina to issue the Ordinance of Nullification, saying that they will not pay the tariff of 1828 or 1832. Jackson responds fiercely and with intense anger. He decides that the federal government must be followed, which is funny. He just killed the national bank. But this is a law that he signed into effect. So therefore, he feels that South Carolina is challenging his executive power. So he says that the actions of South Carolina are treason. He actually publishes an article in a South Carolina newspaper saying that South Carolina better straighten up or he's going to bring the military in and slaughter everybody. Jackson, this was not an idle threat on his part. And he gets Congress to pass the force bill to back up his threat. The force bill says that he's allowed to use the military to enforce the tariff of 1828 and 1832. South Carolina, seeing that he now has threatened to invade South Carolina and Congress has signed off on it, they decide that they're going to try to negotiate. Henry Clay, who is responsible, remember, for the 1820 Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay compromises the situation again. Jackson agrees to back off if South Carolina agrees to pay the tariff. South Carolina agrees to pay a lowered version of the tariff. They sign off on it. Jackson signs off on it. Everybody agrees, and the crisis is averted. However, they are anticipating and foreshadowing the causes of the Civil War. Remember that a lot of the tensions are around slavery. Even the nullification crisis, while it's about the tariff, is about the economic system, which is based on enslavement. Abolitionists, while they talk about freedoms and they talk about the pro-slavery folks, while they talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and they talk about being worried about losing their freedoms, they're worried about losing their enslaved property. Abolitionists began to send anti-slavery pamphlets through the mail. The mail is, by the way, one of the only offices of the government that's listed in the Constitution. Pro-slavery Southerners actually broke into the post offices, would take any of the mail that had to do with abolition and destroy it, which is a felony. Later, the Congress is going to implement something called a gag rule so that Congress couldn't even talk about slavery. The main issue of the day, and they weren't allowed to bring it up at all. So there's a lot of sectional tension, which leads to a lot of censorship, and people are just trying to find ways to avoid talking about it, which is weird because the South is what we'd call a biracial culture. It's really broken down by race-based chattel slavery. Even non-slaveholding white folks would have supported the race-based slavery, even if they didn't enslave people themselves. There's this hope for social advancement. Enslavement meant that there's a floor on how low a white person could fall on the social hierarchy. It unified the white population and this idea of racial superiority. You can see here the idea of the happy slave myth begins to promulgate and go forward. The idea being, if the enslaved population was happy, how could they possibly be upset about enslavement? Which that myth is going to be used over and over and over again, even into the modern era, and we'll talk about how that becomes problematic more later. It is important to note that there's many layers to the South, right? The South is diverse, and even at the time of the Civil War, not everybody was pro-Confederacy. You have the Deep South. This is the heavy cotton production areas. They had a high enslaved population. They're going to be the first ones to secede when it comes time. There's the Upper South, which has more diverse agriculture, and they have more of a medium slave population. And then there's what we're going to call the border states, and they're not very dependent on slave labor, very small population, maybe between 2 and 10% of the population was enslaved, compared to, say, the lower Deep South, which was between 40 and 50% of the population was enslaved. Cotton became king here, especially after the development of the cotton gin. Cotton gin was developed in 1794. It made it easier to get the seeds out of the cotton, which meant that this luxury product could now become a staple product. And it became so important that after the 1820s, it was the number one exported product in America all the way up to the Civil War. Now, again, the North doesn't have clean hands on this. Manufacturing and trade in the North depended on cheap cotton from the South. All of those textile factories in the North were getting cheap labor, right? Or I'm sorry, getting cheap cotton from the South. 2/3 of the Southern cotton went to Northern industrialized factories. This meant that the North needed cheap, unskilled labor. More immigrants are moving there. The North becomes more diverse. The population is growing higher. They get an outsized weight in the House of Representatives because of this growth through immigration and natural reproduction. The fact that they don't have an enslaved population that doesn't count towards their representation. Later, Southerners are going to argue that chattel slavery, the slavery as practiced in the South, is better than Northern wage slavery, that workers in factories are at the mercy of the boss. They can be fired at any time. If they get hurt, they're going to lose their job. They lose their income. Again, based on this idea of the happy slave, right? If the slaves are happy, then they must be better off than the wage earners of the North who have to struggle daily to make ends meet. This is very paternalistic, which means that it's very they treat the enslaved population like children. It's very dehumanizing in the sense that it takes away all agency and choice. This idea, this myth, which we will see later that the enslaved people were not happier than the northern workers. Okay. We talked about King Cotton. Each one of these is a bale of cotton, which is quite heavy. This is where cotton spread. So you can see here, this is the original cotton production in 1820. And then this is 1860. You can see that the cotton production has moved into the West. This is Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama. Sometimes this is called the Black Belt. This is where the majority of cotton production was. And if you look closely, you'll notice that this is the most intense slave territories. Not on the coast here, because on the coast, this is still rice and tobacco. But cotton production, as cotton production increased, so didn't the amount of slaves in the United States. You can see here, the green is cotton production, blue is the number of enslaved people in the United States. So in 1790, what would we call that? About 800,000. By 1820, cotton production is going up. So isn't the slave population, to the point where you see in 1840 and then 1860, the cotton gin leads to more cotton production, which leads to a growth in enslavement. That also means that there is a market for enslaved people, a domestic market, because in 1808, the United States decided to ban the importation of foreign enslaved people. So no more slaves directly from Africa. And yet we can see that the enslaved population grew exponentially on that last graph. And this is a lot because of domestic slave trade. Up here in these southern states, right, the border states and the upper South, they didn't need their enslaved population as much. So if they got surplus population, in other words, enslaved women had children, which sometimes was forced upon them by the masters themselves, those children would be sold into the Deep South. It was also used as a way to punish enslaved people that were not being cooperative. Slave families were routinely broken up, sometimes as a punishment, sometimes because the owner needed money. This is a psychological violence towards the enslaved population, right? Not all the violence is physical, though physical violence was routine, even amongst benevolent owners, people that treated their enslaved population well. The threat of violence was there. The threat of emotional and psychological torture was there as well. This is the problem with enslavement. There were efforts to forge a slave community, which we talked about previously with the Gullah culture, but we'll see as time goes on that there were efforts to create a Black community in the South.